Well, on this day in 1913, the Natives Land Act was passed. The act made provision for black people to only be able to own about 7% of arable land, while the white population received the majority of the fertile land for farming. This meant that white people, who at the time only constituted 20% of the population, were allocated 80% of the land, leaving the majority of the African population as farm employees and not owners. Well, how has this instituted the situation we find ourselves in, with the expropriation of land without compensation debate still being waged? We speak to lawyer and author of The Land is Ours Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi. Advocate, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us this morning. The act itself was enacted 109 years ago, but so much of it is still, or at least the consequences of it, are still dominating discourse today. Talk to us about how the legislation is still shaping South Africa's contemporary landscape today and, of course, the politics of today as well.
Yes, I mean, perhaps to first situate the Act itself. The Act was a culmination of literally a century and a half of war waged by the British against the indigenous people of this country. And it came at a time when the British and the Dutch, the white population in this country, were consolidating their grip over the economic, political, and social institutions. And it came shortly after the 1909 Act of Union, by which the country today we know as South Africa was literally established overnight. But after its establishment, what the essentially European race, because that's how they called themselves, wanted to do was to divide the country territorially. And this piece of legislation, it germinated in 1912 already with some of the ideas of Perry Herzog, who was a white supremacist, who believed that native people should be confined to native reserves, and they should only access urban centers and European areas as visitors with no rights of citizenship or rights of ownership of the land. When the Act was finally passed in June of 1913, Herzog's views still remained dominant, even though there was a new Minister for Native Affairs at the time. It was Sauer. Its framework was very clear and basic. Native people had no right to buy land in European areas. They could only do so if they had the permission of the governor. The governor was white. The European areas constituted 93%. I was very pleased to hear from your introductory segment that you have those percentages right. And the native areas constituted only 7%. Now that shaped the economic imbalance in South Africa for the next 89 years. Because in 1991, that act was scrapped. But its consequences in the land division remained. President Mandela's government signed into law the very first piece of legislation was intended to undo the systemic and perhaps systematic legacies of the Native Land Act, because his first act of parliament was the Restitution Act. Unfortunately, in the last 28 years, Mandela's wish to restore the dignity of African people by restoring their ownership of their land and the ownership, consequently, of their country has largely been unfulfilled because of the slow pace in land reform and because of the chronic corruption that the ANC government has become, and because of the sheer incompetency of the administrators of the land reform program. So today, not only are we still engaged with the terrible legacy of the past, we have new legacies that have simply added to the crisis of dispossession.
Mm. Well, I mean, Advocate, you've mentioned the economic imbalance that is currently shaping South Africa's contemporary landscape and politics, and we see the visible results of that economic imbalance, which then lends to the question, why has land reform been such a catastrophic venture? If even during Nelson Mandela's administration, his first act of parliament was the Land Restitution Act, an attempt at trying to solve this very problem that we're currently finding ourselves in. Why are we facing such major pitfalls when it comes to this all-important element or aspect of, true freedom for South Africans?
You have to divide the answer into structural and behavioral reasons. Structurally, the problem is too deep, because the problem that one is fixing is a problem of 350 years of European conquest and dispossession. Land is no longer a mere piece of ground. It has transmogrified into bonds, into credit, into access to money. But the dispossession itself has created a large black underclass. Remember, land was not the only asset taken from African people. What they were robbed of primarily is the economy. And their economy was in the form of cattle, which they could use to trade. They could use for cultural reasons. They could use for making peace, or indeed making war. And the dispossession of cattle by a combination of theft, of trickery, and war meant that the sole means of production that African people had at their disposal was taken away together with conquest over territory, over land. Now, what that meant is that black people had to turn themselves into wage laborers. They had to literally leave the places where they were born in order to sell their bodies to the capitalist economy that began and boomed from the 1920s to the 1940s, and it was at its zenith in the 1960s with apartheid capitalism and exploitative work practices. Now, resolving that problem of dispossession magnified by exploitative capitalism and racism of apartheid is not an easy undertaking. But beyond the structural problems, the ANC government has also been responsible for the abject failure of reforms, because it has lacked the political will to confront the problem of the white ownership of land. It has failed to give effect to its own promises contained in the Freedom Charter, contained in the Constitution. It has vacillated, initially making promises for radical reforms, abandoning those promises at a later stage. Most recently, the vacillation has been most clearly in relation to the ANC's own resolution taken at the Newzroom conference that it would embark on strategies to expropriate land without compensation. It didn't need to change the constitution for that, but it told the nation that it would change the constitution. But it failed to do so either. But in addition, it failed also to pass laws, which it should have done in 1994 already, to pass laws to entitle it as the governing party with a strong majority to implement the reforms that are necessary for a redistribution of land. So I'm afraid to say, although the structural constraints are deep, much of the blame is to be laid at the door of the ANC's abject failure to do the job it undertook to do when it became the government.
Right. And unfortunately, on that note, Advocate, we are going to have to leave that all-important discussion there. That was lawyer and author of the Land is Ours Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, helping us to reflect on the 109 years since the enactment of the Natives Land Act.